Far Cry games have always been really good at taking the moments that are affecting us most and infusing the bad guys with those characteristics. In Far Cry 5, the villains spoke to an internal nihilism that we were all facing in that era, and this belief that death and destruction would have to be better than what we have now, in that case with the Joseph Seed cult. Far Cry 6, on the other hand, is a look at the political strife of American imperialism versus independent global South powers. It's a fascinating political look and likely the most outwardly political game I've ever played, despite Ubisoft suggesting perhaps that it isn't, and that's what I want to talk about today. There's going to be a lot of people much better than I explaining the ins and outs of the gameplay mechanics, what it all offers, and how it all connects together. Very basically, after playing this game entirely, it's a lot of what you've seen before, only bigger, not necessarily better. If in the previous game you had one base to deal with, now you have three. If in the previous game you had a few weapons that you could customize, now you have over 100 that have dozens of customizations. If you had a couple hundred missions beforehand, now there's even more. Sometimes that's wonderful, a lot of times that's tedious, but the main thing that always interests me about the Far Cry series are the villains and what they represent. So I want to talk a little bit about Anton Castile, the dictator of the fictional country of Yara, which is absolutely a placeholder for Cuba or possibly even Colombia. You can replace it with any country in South America that has something that the West wants. So Anton Castillo is the current dictator in Yara. He is the son of the former dictator that was ousted and brutally tortured in 67 by the Legends, which are represented as kind of a communist revolution. Once that happened, though, there was an American blockade in this fictional world that really devastated the country and the region. This mirrors, of course, what has happened in the global South due to American influence for the past 50 years. There are easily a dozen countries that it is proven the CIA had active operations within, and America had diplomatic tensions with, mostly culminating in these blockades. In Yara, these blockades led to such destitution that eventually the people were disillusioned with this idea of a communist revolution and decided instead to vote for Castillo. Anton promised to bring decadence and prosperity and a return to norms, also making sure that the new Viviro wonder drug would be used effectively. Essentially, it's discovered that on this small, very poor country island, there is a drug that can cure cancer that has to do with the tobacco plants that grow there. When Anton gets into power, he ups the production of that and then makes the crucial decision not to sell any of this wonder drug to any Western powers that have previously push their influence on this small country. It's a really interesting thought experiment when applied to real-world politics. Imagine what would happen now if a country like Cuba discovered, let's just say, the cure for COVID. Imagine what American forces would do, and more broadly Western powers would do, to ensure that they get access to this wonder drug. In Far Cry 6, we discover what that is. They help support a guerrilla rebellion just like the real American forces have done for decades, only this time we are the face of it. You discover very early on as you're playing this character, Danny, a guerrilla fighter to take down Castillo, that your organization is funded by the CIA, specifically through a CIA taskmaster that you have that's your second in command. You find this out very early on, so I don't really consider it a spoiler for the story. And I just want to consider that for a second, what Ubisoft and Ubisoft Toronto specifically are trying to tell us by making the player essentially identify with many of the different quote-unquote terrorist forces that have been backed by American money, specifically through the CIA in the global South for decades. It's as if we are the Contras and fighting the Sandinistas. Now, when you actually play the game, they deal with this problem by making Castillo and his home army seeking independence, the most cartoonishly gruesome and horrific human beings on the planet. There's artists that are making statues out of humans dipped in molten lava. They're brutally torturing and killing everyone in every way possible. So it's very easy to frame them as the bad guys, despite all of the environmental information telling us that we should, as the guerrilla forces, be the bad guys. They muddy the waters a little bit with Castillo citing some really damning truths about American independence versus the needed steps of a small country like Ayara that's basically agrarian to boost itself economically. They didn't get, 200, 400 years of active slavery in order to boost their coffers, so they need to have something that's kind of a byproduct of it. Now, it's not really a fair assessment to justify human misery, but it is one kind of to spit in the face of American forces saying, how could you? This is the worst thing imaginable. You need to be overthrown. So that is definitely mentioned and tried to be presented, that the Castillo forces are the worst human beings on the planet, but also they're flirting with the idea that they represent the ideals of what it means to have real, true independence. How the story progresses is equally confusing because it really does muddy the waters between who we are, what we represent historically in this region, and what the game is trying to tell us. Clearly, Castillo's forces are the enemy, but it's almost trying to justify itself in some ways, which is a very Far Cry thing to do, by citing actual moments in the history of the Global South. So the question has to be asked, what is Ubisoft trying to say about the idea of American imperialism or even Western imperialism in the Global South, in these countries that have had this struggle that's been ongoing for hundreds of years? After playing the game and considering how things are positioned, I think that Ubisoft has done something wonderfully unique and is going to manage to upset virtually every demographic and every group of people that could be playing this game. If you're more right-leaning and see American hegemony as something that's important for global peace, this all makes sense and this story should be told great. But there is a whole side arc where a third of the game is in the shoes and telling the story of a trans man and his inability to have equal rights in Yara. And once the guerrillas take power, likely that will change. That might upset you. If you are someone who just doesn't want politics in your video game, this is by far the most political game I've ever played because it speaks to an active political situation that's happening right now and is dealing with those forces in interesting ways. If perhaps you're someone like me that more identifies left-leaning and think that this American force in the Global South has caused human misery, it's astonishing that they have painted us as the bad guys, as the Contras, as the American-backed freedom fighters that are willing to destroy the government of their home country in order to ensure that a miracle drug gets into American hands. It's a uniquely strange situation. I can't wait until people play it, but I think from now on we can understand completely that Ubisoft's games are entirely political and they speak to a moment. I just think, unfortunately, they don't speak to it very well.